Right, as fun as that last video was, this time out we're just going to go over some quick details about these two compressors, both manufactured by Bill Putnam and Universal Audio in the late 60s. The top unit here is called the LA2A, the bottom unit is the 1176. They've both been reissued numerous times. They've had multiple revisions. These two that we are looking at right now are part of the UA Classics line of reissues. Let's start with the LA2A, and I'm going to turn it on here. Going from the API 2500 to the LA2A is a little bit of a shock because the API was so overly featured and had such unusual controls and things that maybe we aren't accustomed to seeing, whereas the LA2A has the fewest controls of maybe any of our equipment that we have in these racks. Really, there are two knobs that do most of the work. On the left, you see there is gain, and on the right, there is peak reduction. I want to be clear. The signal hits the gain after it has been through the compressor. Now, this is confusing to our brains because we are used to thinking of things traveling from left to right, unless you're a guitar player and then you always plug into the right side of the stomp box and then come out of the left side, right? This is makeup gain. This is gain after compression here. Peak reduction deals with where your threshold is and input level as well. So as I turn peak reduction to the right, I am simultaneously lowering the threshold and increasing input gain. Now, both of those things give us more compression. So by doing this one action, I am simultaneously doing two things that are going to result in more compression overall, which means smaller changes on this compressor tend to have bigger effects, right? The third knob that you see here controls what our meter is displaying. We've got gain reduction in the center, and then output with +4 being our line level, our professional line level on the right. There is an output +10 that I believe is related to a different standard for line level, some sort of broadcast radio standard for line level that just has a different signal strength. But in recording studios using professional line level, we're talking about +4. So if you want to see your output meter accurately reflecting what we think of as our line level signal, then you would put this to +4. Most of the time, we're going to leave that knob on gain reduction. You'll notice when it's in gain reduction, the needle points to 0. It starts here. And as signal crosses the threshold, the needle will pull backwards to show you the amount of gain reduction that is occurring. Because the job of a compressor is to turn things down, to reduce amplitude in the peaks, this compressor then has makeup gain to make up for the signal that was lost in the process of compression. So this is a tube compressor, and that does mean that if you drive the input or output, you will probably at some point begin to generate those smooth, harmonic distortion characteristics that we think of from tubes. Now, if you drive it really hard, you can get to a definite overdriven sound, but that's generally not why we are using this compressor, although it can be an interesting effect sometimes, for sure. But typically, we think of the tubes as adding a very subtle harmonic distortion characteristic to the signal. The other interesting thing about the LA2A is that it is based on a photo optic cell. So there is an optical resistor in there. That means as signal strength increases, as the input signal increases, there is a tiny light bulb. It's actually a tiny little, they used to call it a night light because I think when Bill Putnam started manufacturing these, they were using light bulbs that were either similar to or actually used for night lights. But there is a light bulb in there that will glow brighter. Makes sense. As you increase signal strength, the light glows brighter. Well, there's this thing in there that is a photosensitive cell. And as the light glows brighter on that cell, it increases its properties of resistance. And that is how this compressor is actually working. The night light shines brighter as the signal gets louder, causes greater resistance on the photosensitive cell, and then as the signal goes below the threshold, the light dims or turns off, and the cell opens back up. I mean, it's not actually closing and opening, but its resistance properties are stronger and weaker. And it allows the signal to pass through. So there you have it, the LA2A. Interesting device. You'll notice no attack and release controls on the LA2A. It has a fixed attack time that is 10 milliseconds, which is a fairly slow attack time as these things go. Its release is variable because it's based on sort of the inherent properties of this photo-optic cell. And one of the properties of that cell is that the longer it has high resistance, the slower it opens back up, the slower it allows signal to flow freely. So its release is variable, but you don't have control over how that varies. All right, let's talk about this, the 1176. This is not a tube compressor. It is based on a transistor circuit instead of vacuum tubes like the LA2A. There again is an input and output control. This time the input is on the left and the output is on the right, which for a lot of us makes a little bit more sense. But you have to remember, going back and forth between these two compressors, that those things are reversed from one to the next. Input, as I turn that knob to the right, does the same thing that peak reduction does on the LA2A. Simultaneously increases gain coming in and lowers the threshold, both resulting in greater compression. Output is makeup gain. Output is the output of the circuit. Here we do have an attack and release. The attack times on the 1176 are all very fast. So whether you start all the way to the left or all the way to the right, you are never crossing the threshold of a millisecond. Even the slowest attack time on the 1176 is less than a millisecond of attack time. It's a very fast compressor. To make up for how fast it is, that fast attack can sometimes come off as really aggressive, or you can hear sort of that gain reduction engaging in a way that is unpleasant. To help reduce that problem, there is a fixed soft knee on the 1176. So it is always sort of swelling up to ratio. That's just to kind of compensate for how fast the attack and release times are. The release time, I shouldn't say is fast. The release knob has a fairly standard set of release times ranging, and I gave you the manuals to these compressors, but ranging from somewhere around 30 to 50 milliseconds at the fastest, going up, above a second at the slowest. And I don't remember exactly what those ranges are for release, but you can look that up in the manual that I posted on Falcon Online. There are 4 ratios that are available. You notice the LA2A did not give us control over ratio. There are 4 ratios available on the 1176, 4-to-1, 8-to-1, 12-to-1, 20-to-1. So truly this is a compressor limiter. Once we get past that 10-to-1 range, remember we are in limiting. But, and this is going to sound crazy, but hang with me, there's this thing that for a long time, for many years after this device was released, after the 1176 was released, for many years this was sort of just a trick or a tip that engineers would pass around to each other that Universal Audio didn't officially acknowledge. Now it's something they brag about. Now it's something that, plugins try to copy and emulate. But if you take all 4 of your fingers and jam in all 4 of those ratio buttons and wiggle them around until they stick, you're definitely hearing this in my voice probably because my vocal is running through this device. It engages what we call smash mode, which is, well, an interesting sound. It's definitely a high ratio compression. It definitely has a distortion characteristic to it that is interesting. We'll go back to 4-to-1 here. Finally, on the 1176, we can once again control what the meter displays. The 2 meter functions that tend to be important to us are gain reduction, where we are right now, and then that +4 output, much like what we had on the LA2A here. Let's see, what else can I tell you about this? Oh, one more interesting feature. The amplifier circuit in this can be used without engaging the compressor. And the way you do that is by taking the attack knob and turning it all the way to the left until you hear it click off. And at that point, you can use your input and output controls to control the amplifier part of this without ever triggering the detector of the compressor. All right, that wraps up everything I wanted to tell you about these two devices. I've put manuals for all three of the compressors I've talked about in these videos on Falcon Online. You can read through those if you like. Thank you very much, and I will see you in class soon.